When people think of World War II, they often picture heavy tanks with thick armor and massive guns, steel beasts like the Tiger, Panther, or KV-1. In that world, the idea of creating a tank destroyer with armor as thin as paper but with the speed of a sports car seemed almost insane. Yet, it was precisely this madness that opened an entirely new path in the design philosophy of combat vehicles. And to understand why the United States chose such a different approach, we have to go back to the early 1940s, when the world was stunned by Germany's blitzkrieg. In 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, the country collapsed in just 35 days, despite fielding an army of nearly 1 million men. 2 years later, France, possessing the largest army in Europe, could not last more than 6 weeks against the unstoppable Wehrmacht. The whole world realized that modern war was nothing like World War I. Gone were the endless trenches and attritional assaults. Germany had proven a new truth. Speed and mobility, combined with concentrated firepower, could shatter any defense line. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was not merely a tactic, but a revolution in military thinking. In the United States, reports from Europe sent shockwaves through the army. At the time, the U.S. military was still small, rooted in defensive doctrine, but now it was forced to rethink its entire approach to warfare. If Germany could sweep across Europe with fast-moving armored divisions, could America's slow, heavy infantry and artillery formations hope to withstand them? The answer, clearly, was no. One of the first to grasp this problem was Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce, a veteran cavalry officer. Trained in the era when horse cavalry still mattered, Bruce understood the value of speed, maneuverability, and the ability to strike at the enemy's flanks and rear. To him, German tanks were nothing more than a new form of cavalry, a mobile, concentrated force designed to break through front lines and wreak havoc behind them. And to counter that, the U.S. could not rely solely on heavy tanks. What it needed was its own form of mechanized cavalry, machines that didn't need thick armor, but had to be fast enough to strike and vanish before the enemy could react. At first, the idea seemed outrageous. To traditional generals, an armored fighting vehicle had to be built around armor, able to withstand enemy fire to survive. But Bruce and his supporters argued differently. No matter how thick the armor, enemy guns could eventually pierce it. The one thing no shell could hit was the empty space left behind after a vehicle had moved. In other words, don't block the shot, dodge it. Don't be a fortress, be a hunter, always choosing the time and place to strike. From this vision, the tank destroyer doctrine was born. Unlike tanks, their mission was not to charge, break through, or support infantry. Instead, tank destroyer units were expected to move rapidly to hotspots, ambush from favorable positions, and deliver quick, precise blows against enemy armor. Their motto was summed up in 3 words: seek, strike, destroy. By late 1941, the U.S. Army began issuing technical requirements for a new tank destroyer. At first, they considered a modest 37mm gun sufficient against Panzer I. But the battlefield quickly changed. With the arrival of Panzer III and I-4, the 37mm was obsolete. The requirement rose to 57 meters, then 75 meter, and finally settled at a 76-meter gun, light enough to preserve speed, yet powerful enough to penetrate German armor at medium range. Various chassis options were explored. At one point, the Christie suspension, famous for enabling Soviet tanks to reach high speeds, was considered. But in the end, America chose the torsion bar system, more durable and better suited for mass production by the automobile industry. As for the engine, engineers selected the Wright R975, an air-cooled aircraft engine. It was a bold choice, extremely powerful for its weight, but demanding a completely different chassis design. By April 1943, Buick unveiled the T-70 prototype, stunning observers. In trials, it reached speeds over 50 mph, something no tracked vehicle had ever achieved. American officers who witnessed it called it a tank flying across the ground. From the T-70, the M18 Hellcat was officially approved for mass production. While Americans celebrated, the Germans dismissed it. Intelligence reports describing a light tank with thin armor and mediocre armament were quickly disregarded by Wehrmacht officers. With years of combat experience, they believed that a machine weighing under 18 tons with armor less than 25 mm thick could never survive in battle. To them, this was just American naivete, the folly of a nation untouched by continental warfare. They still clung to the dogma that tanks must have thick armor and heavy guns, and anything else was a waste. But reality soon proved otherwise. When the Hellcat debuted in Italy and later in France, it became a nightmare for German tank crews accustomed to dominating the battlefield. While Panthers and Tigers took precious seconds to traverse their turrets, the Hellcat could fire and vanish within moments. German commanders were forced to adjust their tactics, but even then, the Hellcat's unmatched speed made countermeasures nearly useless. Thus, the birth of the M18 Hellcat was more than a technical achievement. It was the result of strategic thinking, a response to Germany's Blitzkrieg revolution. From the realization that armor could never guarantee survival and the belief that speed itself could be a new kind of armor, America created a unique war machine that defied convention. That bold choice opened a new chapter in the history of armored warfare, not just in World War II, but for decades to come. If Part 1 told the story of how the U.S. tank destroyer doctrine was born, then Part 2 is where we look directly at the machine that embodied that philosophy, the M18 Hellcat. This was not just a combat vehicle, but a symbol of a radically new mindset, one that treated speed as armor, mobility as a shield, and tactical flexibility as the key to survival. To truly understand the Hellcat, we need to break down its design, armor, firepower, engine, turret, and how all of these combined into something unlike any other tank of its time. The first striking feature of the Hellcat was its weight. At just 17.7 tons, it was almost half the weight of a Panzer IV, or a third of a Panther, and barely a quarter of a Tiger I. To achieve this, Buick engineers virtually abandoned the idea of thick armor. The hull and turret front were protected by no more than 25 mm of steel, while the sides and rear had only 13 mm, and in some spots, even 50 caliber heavy machine guns could punch through. Many U.S. soldiers, upon first seeing the Hellcat, were uneasy, nicknaming it a thin steel coffin. But to those who believed in the doctrine of speed as armor, this was the key. Shedding weight to achieve speeds unheard of for a tracked vehicle. And indeed, the Hellcat's speed shocked the world. On roads, it could reach 55 miles per hour, nearly 90 km/h, faster than the military Jeep of its era. Even cross-country, it maintained 25 to 30 mph, outpacing any tank. Thanks to its 400 horsepower Wright R975 aircraft-derived engine, the Hellcat had a power-to-weight ratio of 22.6 HP/ton, the highest of World War II. But speed alone didn't make the Hellcat a tank killer. Firepower mattered too. It was armed with the 76mm M1A2 gun, an improvement over the 75mm M3 used on Shermans. While it couldn't rival the German 88mm KWK-36 on the Tiger or the 75mm KWK-42 on the Panther at long range, the 76mm could still penetrate the front armor of a Panzer IV and the side armor of Panthers and Tigers at 800-1000 meters when using HVAP armor-piercing rounds. In practice, most tank engagements in Europe occurred under 1,000 meters due to terrain, forests, and villages limiting visibility, making the 76mm more than adequate. The crew also had a 50 caliber Browning M2 mounted on the turret roof, useful for both anti-aircraft and infantry suppression. Another unique feature was the hydraulic-powered rotating turret. While many German tanks still relied on manual or semi-hydraulic systems, taking 25-30 seconds for a full 360-degree rotation, the Hellcat S turret could traverse in about 24 seconds. This gave crews a huge advantage in reacting to sudden threats. Combined with the vehicle's mobility, the Hellcat could swing its gun into position and fire before the enemy could respond. In designing the Hellcat, the Americans had consciously traded passive protection for active survival. Thin armor meant any solid hit was deadly, but superior mobility allowed the crew to evade fire, reposition, and even retreat when needed. The doctrine of shoot and scoot became central. Fire from ambush, then immediately relocate. Unlike traditional tanks that slugged it out head-to-head, the Hellcat stalked, ambushed, and struck from the flanks or rear, disappearing before the enemy could retaliate. In Europe's dense network of roads, villages, and forests, this strategy fit perfectly. Of course, this philosophy carried risks. Hellcat crews constantly lived with the fear that even heavy machine gun fire, mortars, or artillery fragments could destroy their vehicle. A single hit could ignite it. U.S. troops often joked, calling it a tin can. Yet many crews loved its speed. Veterans later said the Hellcat gave them a sense of control over the battlefield, letting them choose when and how to fight, and sometimes turning a tank duel in their favor within minutes. Another key strength of the Hellcat came from the organization of U.S. tank destroyer battalions. Unlike tanks, which were permanently assigned to infantry or armored divisions, Hellcat units operated independently and could be deployed wherever needed. This made them a rapid reaction force at the operational level. When intelligence warned of German armored concentrations, Hellcat battalions could be rushed into ambush positions within hours, ready to unleash sudden, devastating strikes that shattered enemy counterattacks. From an industrial perspective, the Hellcat reflected a distinctly American philosophy: fast, cheap, and easy to maintain. Its lightweight design and simple construction allowed mass production in converted civilian automobile plants. More than 2,500 Hellcats were built between 1943 and 1944, enough to equip numerous battalions across Europe. Maintenance was straightforward. The Wright R975 engine had been produced in the tens of thousands, with spare parts readily available. By contrast, German Panthers and Tigers were expensive, complex, and prone to breakdowns. The Hellcat, though economical, proved highly effective. All these elements combined into a vehicle unlike any tank of its era. The Hellcat was not a mobile fortress like the Tiger, nor a versatile all-rounder like the Sherman. It was more akin to a lone hunter, always moving, always striking at the weak points, never standing still to trade blows. In 1943-1944, this was a daring, even risky design philosophy, but on the battlefield it worked. When German crews first faced the Hellcat, many were caught off guard. Accustomed to tank duels fought toe-to-toe, they suddenly faced an enemy that appeared from a tree line, fired, and vanished, only to reappear from another angle moments later. Before a Panther or Tiger could traverse its heavy turret, the Hellcat had already shifted position. This unpredictability created not only physical destruction, but also psychological terror. It was exactly what American designers and tacticians had envisioned. The Hellcat, as a mobile nightmare, the Germans could never adapt to. In the end, the M18 Hellcat was more than a weapon. It was proof of the power of innovation under wartime pressure. While the rest of the world obsessed over thicker armor and bigger guns, the Americans dared to take the opposite path, shedding armor, embracing speed, and accepting risk in exchange for absolute mobility. That difference made the Hellcat not just effective, but legendary. The fastest tracked vehicle of World War II, and a lasting symbol of the idea that in modern war, agility can matter more than raw strength. In the summer of 1943, as the North African Front had just ended with the disastrous defeat of the German-Italian Army Group, the Allies were ready to move into continental Europe. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, marked the beginning of a new phase, and it was here that the M18 Hellcat was first committed to battle. Fresh from the Buick factory, still bearing their factory paint, the Hellcats were shipped across the Atlantic to North African ports and quickly pressed into service in the Italian campaign. For many crews, it was their first encounter with real combat, and nothing could test a new design more than the brutal reality of war. In Sicily and later on the Italian peninsula, the terrain was complex: mountains, narrow roads, and densely packed villages. It was far from ideal ground for large-scale mechanized breakthroughs like those on the Russian steppes. Yet it was precisely under these conditions that the Hellcat revealed its strengths. Light and fast, it could climb hills, maneuver through narrow roads, and seize ambush positions where Shermans or heavier tanks would struggle. At Salerno, a platoon of Hellcats suddenly appeared on the flank of a Panzer Grenadier unit assaulting the beaches, firing at ranges under 500 meters and destroying several German armored vehicles within minutes. After firing, they quickly withdrew through a narrow mountain pass, evading counterfire. This style of fighting, swift, unexpected, then disappearing, confused the Germans, who were used to slower, more static enemies. One of the first major actions for the Hellcat in Italy came near Anzio in 1944. The Germans launched fierce counterattacks, deploying both Panthers and Tiger I tanks to drive the Allies into the sea. Hellcat units were employed as rapid response forces, constantly shifting between threatened sectors. Some reports noted that in a single afternoon, one Hellcat platoon traveled more than 20 kilometers, fought at 3 separate hotspots, and knocked out over a dozen German tanks. Losses were heavy. Several Hellcats were destroyed by the first enemy volleys, but the tactical effect was clear. German counterattacks were blunted, and American infantry held their beachhead. From this point, Allied commanders began to see the Hellcat not as a light tank in the traditional sense, but as a mobile tool to turn the tide in critical moments. Italy, however, also revealed the Hellcat's fatal weakness: its thin armor. Any mistake could cost an entire crew their lives. A single artillery shell, or even a well-placed mortar round on the turret roof, could set it ablaze. Some units lost nearly half their vehicles within weeks. Soldiers gave the Hellcat grim nicknames like Casket on Tracks and Paper Tank. Yet these very hardships sharpened the crew's instincts and tactical skills. They learned to keep moving, exploit terrain, avoid head-on fights, and always shoot first before the enemy could react. By the summer of 1944, after the Italian campaign had bogged down at the Gustav Line and Monte Cassino, the focus shifted to France. On June 6, 1944, D-Day opened the door into Western Europe. Within weeks, the first Hellcat units landed at Normandy to join the liberation of France. Here, the Hellcat would enter its most famous battles. As the Allies broke out from the beaches and the Normandy pocket, the Germans launched counterattacks to hold their lines. One of the fiercest clashes occurred near Mortagne, where an SS Panzer division with Panthers and Tigers attempted to split the American forces. Hellcat battalions were rushed in, using the rural road network and woods to set ambushes. American soldiers later recalled seeing Panthers struck from the flank or rear, bursting into flames before they could traverse their turrets. With its speed, the Hellcat could outmaneuver any tank circling behind them. Though its 76mm gun could not penetrate Panther frontal armor at range, at 500-800 meters against the flanks, it was deadly. Yet it was in September 1944, at Ardennes, France, that the Hellcat truly carved its legend. Many historians consider this the grand stage for the Hellcat. At the time, General Patton's Third Army was advancing rapidly through Lorraine. In a desperate bid to halt them, the Germans launched a counterattack with over 200 tanks, Panthers, Panzer IVs, and some Tigers, striking at the American flank. Ardennes' fog and open fields favored tank warfare, but here the Hellcat proved its tactical worth. Hellcat battalions swiftly maneuvered into key positions, concealing themselves behind villages and hedgerows. When German tank columns appeared, the Hellcat struck, knocking out the lead vehicle before withdrawing, throwing enemy formations into confusion. In several engagements, a single Hellcat platoon of 40 to 5 vehicles held off entire German companies, destroying multiple tanks in under half an hour. Thanks to their speed, they always dictated the fight. When pressed, they simply relocated and reappeared from another angle to fire again. The Germans were stunned, unable to understand how their opponent could vanish and reappear so quickly. By the battle's end, over 80 German tanks were destroyed, while Hellcat losses numbered only a few dozen. The kill-to-loss ratio exceeded 3.1, an extraordinary figure for armored combat in World War II. At Ardennes, the Hellcat's reputation was sealed, and Wehrmacht reports for the first time acknowledged the danger posed by this American tank destroyer. Looking back at 1943-1944, the Hellcat had evolved from experimental deployment in Italy to decisive victories in France. Despite heavy losses, it proved that the doctrine of speed over armor was viable in real combat. The Hellcat was not invincible; any mistake could doom it. But in the hands of skilled crews and within Patton's mobile tactics, it became a nightmare for German armor. For the Allies, the Hellcat was not only a weapon of war, but also a symbol of boldness, of breaking with tradition, and ultimately, of success. In the mechanized world of World War II, where German armored giants like the Tiger and Panther spread terror across the battlefield, the arrival of the M18 Hellcat stood out as a bold contrast. It was not a heavy tank with hundreds of millimeters of armor, nor a massive self-propelled gun with overwhelming firepower. Instead, the Hellcat was designed around an entirely different philosophy. Speed is armor. This became the foundation of a unique and revolutionary tactic in modern warfare: shoot and scoot. If the Sherman was considered the U.S. Army's universal hammer, then the Hellcat was more like a slender but razor-sharp dagger. It could not withstand a head-on blow, but it could appear suddenly at an enemy's weak spot and vanish before they could respond. This philosophy was rooted in the American anti-tank doctrine, which envisioned the tank destroyer as a rapid reaction force using speed and mobility to crush massed German armored thrusts. Shoot and scoot was not just a slogan, it was the Hellcat's very survival. With armor only 13 to 25 millimeter thick, it was vulnerable even to heavy machine gun fire or artillery fragments, let alone the 75 millimeter or 88 millimeter shells of German Panzers. This forced Hellcat crews to exploit its unmatched top speed of 88 km/h, far faster than any armored vehicle of the era. That speed allowed Hellcats to dash into ambush positions, fire a few 76 millimeter shells, and then immediately relocate before enemy guns could respond. The Battle of Lorraine in September 1944 provides a textbook example. When the U.S. 4th Armored Division was hit by a surprise counterattack from Germany's 113th Panzer Brigade, equipped with Panthers and Panzer Rifles, American Shermans and towed anti-tank guns struggled. But when the M18 Hellcats of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion entered the fight, the balance shifted. Their crews never stayed in one spot to fire directly. Instead, they used villages, hedgerows, and fog to maneuver to the flanks. A Hellcat might burst out from behind a tree line, pump a few 76 millimeter shells into a Panther's side armor, then retreat before German guns could traverse. In combination with artillery and air support, the Americans repelled the counterattack, marking one of the Hellcat's most notable victories through mobile tactics. The shoot-and-scoot doctrine proved equally effective in the Ardennes in December 1944. When the Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge, many American units were cut off and outnumbered. The Hellcat could not face German armor head-on, but it became a harassing menace. At Bastogne and Nouville, Hellcat crews constantly shifted positions in the winter fog, creating the illusion of a much larger American armored presence. German reports often claimed, "The Americans have too many tanks in this sector," when in reality only a few Hellcat battalions were darting back and forth, firing a few rounds and then vanishing. This illusion bought precious time, slowing the German advance until reinforcements arrived. The success of shoot and scoot rested on three elements: speed, sufficient firepower, and rapid turret traverse. First, the Hellcat S-88 km H top speed made it faster than any enemy tank and even quicker than towed artillery. This gave it the ability to redeploy almost instantly, an invaluable trait in fluid battles. Second, its 76mm gun could not penetrate Tiger or Panther frontal armor at range, but at medium distances or from the flank it was deadly. In the right place at the right time, this limitation became a strength. Third, its hydraulic turret could traverse a full circle in under 25 seconds, much faster than German tanks, which relied on motorized or hand-cranked systems. This let the Hellcat acquire new targets without repositioning the entire hull, cutting engagement times and boosting survival odds. Still, shoot and scoot demanded highly skilled crews. A single mistake, such as lingering a few seconds too long after firing, could mean instant destruction. This explains why Hellcat units also suffered significant losses in combat. It was never meant for head-on clashes, but as a tactical weapon it proved devastating when used correctly. German reports acknowledge the Hellcat as one of the most troublesome foes because of its unpredictable mobility. If the Tiger was the hunter with crushing firepower, the Hellcat was the fox, true to its name, appearing unexpectedly where least expected. This reflected the U.S. military philosophy. Rather than racing to match Germany's massive steel monsters, America exploited agility to offset weaknesses in armor and firepower. Beyond battlefield effectiveness, shoot and scoot carried psychological weight. Being stalked by an unseen, fast-moving enemy striking from multiple angles left German crews tense and demoralized. In forests or cities where visibility was poor, a sudden Hellcat ambush could sow far more chaos than a frontal Sherman assault. It demonstrated that war was not only about steel and explosives, but also about nerves and cunning. Strategically, shoot and scoot embodied America's broader World War II military doctrine. Speed, mobility, and concentrated firepower could compensate for thinner armor. This philosophy would influence post-war designs such as Italy's Centauro, France's AMX 10RC, and even U.S. Striker variants, all inheritors of the Hellcat's concept of rapid deployment, precision strikes, and quick withdrawal. In short, the Hellcat and its shoot and scoot doctrine turned a weakness, thin armor, into a strength. Instead of seeing it as a liability, American designers and crews made speed their invisible shield, baffling the enemy and stripping them of their advantages. It proved that in war, the strongest or heaviest weapon does not always win. Sometimes adaptability and agility decide the outcome. After proving its effectiveness on the battlefield with the shoot-and-scoot tactic, the M18 Hellcat entered its peak period of operations from mid-1944 until the end of World War II. This was the stage when both its strengths and weaknesses became most evident, creating a mixed picture of light and shadow regarding the effectiveness of the fastest tank destroyer in World War II history. On paper, the M18 Hellcat was one of the more successful specialized armored vehicles. Between mid-1943 and late 1944, Buick, a division of General Motors, produced about 2,507 Hellcats. This number was far smaller than the more than 50,000 Shermans built. But given its specialized role, serving only in tank destroyer battalions, this was an impressive output. M18 battalions were typically attached to infantry or armored divisions, acting as a rapid reaction force whenever German tank thrusts appeared. Tactically, the Hellcat proved highly effective in certain key battles. At Lorraine, during the Battle of Ardennes, September 1944, the M18 contributed decisively to repelling the German Panzer counterattack. In the Ardennes, December 1944, Hellcats were present at Bastogne, Neuville, and surrounding villages, where they maneuvered constantly through fog, creating the illusion of a much larger American armored presence. According to tank destroyer battalion reports, the Hellcat achieved an average kill-to-loss ratio of about 2.3.1, meaning that for every M18 lost, more than 2 German tanks were destroyed. Compared with Shermans or M10s, M36s, this was a relatively strong performance, especially considering the fragility of the M18. However, it must be emphasized that Hellcat's successes rarely came from the vehicle alone, but from its integration into the broader American firepower system. Every victory against the Panzers involved artillery, air support, and Shermans as well. The Hellcat was simply the sharp edge of the blade, striking at the right moment. For this reason, claims such as Hellcats knocked out dozens of Panthers in one day were often exaggerated or stripped of context. In reality, a large proportion of German tank losses came from airstrikes and artillery fire. The Hellcat's true role was as a flexible tactical tool, slowing enemy advances and enabling U.S. forces to exploit their overall superiority. The Hellcat also had a clear psychological effect. German crews frequently complained about facing an opponent that appeared and vanished too quickly to react to. Especially in tight terrain, the Hellcat maximized its mobility advantage. American crews inside the Hellcat knew well that if they stopped, their thin armor would doom them instantly. Thus, they learned to rely on terrain, speed, and deception tactics to survive. This combat experience turned many Hellcat units into elite formations, contributing significantly to U.S. campaigns in Europe. Yet alongside these achievements came undeniable limitations. The first was its extremely thin armor. With protection only a tenth as thick as the Tigers, the Hellcat could be penetrated by virtually any German anti-tank weapon, and even heavy machine guns or shell fragments could cause serious damage. This meant that crew casualties were high whenever a vehicle was hit. Hellcats often burst into flames after a single enemy shell, since their ammunition and fuel storage were poorly protected. This was the price of their unmatched speed. Second, its 76mm gun offered only adequate firepower. It could reliably defeat Panzer IVs and Stugge IIIs at all ranges. But against Panthers and Tigers, Hellcat crews had to risk closing in or flanking to strike from the sides or rear. Meanwhile, a single shot from the Panther S-75mm QK-42 or the Tiger AS-88mm could destroy the Hellcat from long range. This made direct duels extremely dangerous and generally unfavorable for the Americans. Third, the very concept of the tank destroyer force was becoming obsolete. When the doctrine was conceived, the U.S. Army expected massive German armored offensives similar to early blitzkrieg campaigns. By 1944-1945, however, Germany no longer had the strength to launch large-scale tank offensives, with the Ardennes being a rare exception. For most of the time, Hellcats were used to support infantry, assault fortifications, or perform roles similar to light tanks. In these roles, their fragility became glaring, and at times the M18 was considered unsuitable compared with the more durable Sherman or M10 M36. Moreover, the production of only about 2,500 units reflected the reality that the Hellcat was never a core weapon system. It was a niche solution tailored to the tank destroyer doctrine, not a war-winning tool. Indeed, once the war ended, the U.S. Tank Destroyer Corps was quickly disbanded, and the Hellcat was retired or transferred to other nations' armies. It left little lasting impact on U.S. armored formations, influencing military thinking more than actual equipment. In summary, the M18 Hellcat's achievements and shortcomings show that it was a right time, right place machine. It proved its worth in specific battles, delivering important tactical effects and boosting U.S. morale during difficult moments. But it was no miracle weapon, contrary to later myths. Instead, it was a successful experimental vehicle, demonstrating that speed and agility could, to some extent, substitute for heavy armor and superior firepower. The Hellcat's greatest legacy lay in shaping modern military thought. In the 20th century, many later fighting vehicles, from Germany's Leopard 1, France's AMX-13, to Italy's Centauro and the U.S. Stryker MGS, followed the same philosophy, not too heavy but fast and maneuverable. The Hellcat laid the foundation for this concept, becoming a symbol of the principle that mobility matters more than sheer toughness. After proving its capabilities on the battlefield with the shoot-and-scoot tactic, the M18 Hellcat entered its peak operational phase from mid-1944 until the end of World War II. This was the period when both its strengths and weaknesses were revealed most clearly, creating a mixed picture of light and shadow regarding the effectiveness of the fastest tank destroyer in World War II history. On paper, the M18 Hellcat was one of the more successful specialized armored vehicles. Between mid-1943 and late 1944, Buick, a division of General Motors, produced about 2,507 Hellcats. This number was far fewer than the more than 50,000 Shermans built. But considering its specialized role, serving exclusively in tank destroyer battalions, this was an impressive production figure. M18 battalions were typically assigned to support infantry or armored divisions, acting as a rapid reaction force whenever German tank offensives emerged. Tactically, the Hellcat proved effective in several key battles. At Lorraine, during the Battle of Ardennes, September 1944, the M18 played a decisive role in repelling the German Panzer counterattack. In the Ardennes, December 1944, Hellcats appeared at Bastogne, Nouville, and nearby villages where they maneuvered constantly in the fog, creating the illusion of a much larger American force. According to tank destroyer battalion reports, the Hellcat achieved an average kill-to-loss ratio of about 2.31, meaning that for every M18 lost, more than 2 German tanks were destroyed. Compared with the Sherman or M10 M36, this was a relatively strong performance, especially considering the Hellcat's fragility. However, it must be stated clearly that the Hellcat's achievements rarely came from the vehicle alone, but rather from its integration into the broader American firepower system. Every victory against Panzers involved artillery, air support, and Shermans. The Hellcat was simply the tip of the spear striking at the right moment. For this reason, claims such as Hellcats destroyed dozens of Panthers in a single day were often exaggerated or removed from context. In reality, a large portion of German tank losses came from airstrikes and artillery. The Hellcat's true role was as a flexible tactical instrument, slowing enemy advances and enabling U.S. forces to maximize their overall firepower. The Hellcat also left a strong psychological impression. German crews repeatedly complained about facing an opponent that appeared and disappeared too quickly to react. Especially in confined terrain, the Hellcat maximized its mobility advantage. American crews inside the Hellcat knew well that if they stopped, their thin armor would make them easy targets. As a result, they learned to use terrain, speed, and deception tactics to survive. This combat experience turned many Hellcat units into elite formations, playing important roles in battles across Europe. Yet alongside these achievements were undeniable shortcomings. The first was its extremely thin armor. At just a tenth the thickness of the Tigers, the Hellcat could be penetrated by virtually any German anti-tank gun. Even heavy machine guns or shell fragments could inflict serious damage. This resulted in high crew casualty rates whenever a vehicle was hit. Hellcats often burst into flames after a single enemy shell, since their ammunition and fuel storage were poorly protected. This was the price of their extraordinary speed. Second, its 76mm gun was only adequate. It could reliably defeat Panzer IVs and Stu G3s at any range, but against Panthers or Tigers, Hellcat crews had to take the risky approach of closing in or maneuvering for side and rear shots. Meanwhile, a single round from the Panther S-75 Mini KWK-42 or the Tiger S-88 could destroy a Hellcat from long distance. This made direct confrontations extremely dangerous and generally unfavorable for American forces. Third, the strategic role of the tank destroyer force was becoming obsolete. When this doctrine was conceived, the U.S. Army expected to face massive German armored offensives like the Blitzkrieg campaigns of early war years. But by 1944-1945, Germany no longer had the strength to launch large-scale armored assaults. with the Ardennes as a rare exception. Most of the time, Hellcats were used to support infantry, assault fortifications, or perform roles similar to light tanks. In these roles, their fragility was a major disadvantage, and in some cases, the Hellcat was seen as unsuitable compared to the Sherman or the more heavily armored M10, M36. Furthermore, the production of only about 2,500 vehicles reflected the reality that the Hellcat was never intended to be a mainstay. It was a niche solution built for the tank destroyer doctrine, not a decisive war-winning weapon. Indeed, after the war ended, the U.S. Tank Destroyer Corps was quickly dissolved, and the Hellcat was retired or transferred to other armies. It left little direct legacy in U.S. armored forces, influencing military philosophy more than actual equipment. In conclusion, the Hellcat's accomplishments and limitations show that it was a right time, right place weapon. It proved its value in specific battles, created important tactical effects, and helped sustain American morale during difficult times. But it was not the miracle weapon that later legends sometimes portray. Rather, it was a successful experimental machine, demonstrating that speed and maneuverability could partly substitute for heavy armor and overwhelming firepower. The Hellcat's greatest legacy lay in paving the way for modern military thought. In the 20th century, many later fighting vehicles, from Germany's Leopard 1, France's AMX-13, to Italy S. Centauro, and America S. Stryker MGS, followed the same philosophy. Not too heavy, but fast and maneuverable. The Hellcat laid the foundation for this concept, becoming a symbol of the principle that mobility outweighs sheer toughness.